And now for a session produced by our underwriter. Please welcome Justin Steele, President at google.org.
Knocking good.
Good afternoon. I'm going to give myself a demotion. I'm a principal, and the president of google.org is probably thinking, I didn't promote Justin to president. What's happening? But my name is Justin. I lead all of Google's philanthropy in the US, Canada, and Latin America. And I've had the privilege with my colleague Mab to start the Racial Justice and Criminal Justice Giving Initiative a few years ago, and we've committed $30 million to this work and excited to continue to do more. I'm sure, you can clap if you want to, thank you. I'm sure some of you have been squinting at that google.org logo on those slides and thinking, what the heck, why is Google, of all companies, involved in criminal justice reform? What's the hook, what's the angle, why is this authentic to us? And so I wanted to give a very brief background of how we came to this work and then introduce our partner Phil Goff to tell you a little bit about one of the collaborative projects that we've done with Phil. But if you go back to Google's mission, so Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I think there's a couple of key words in that mission statement that really bring us to this work. The first is accessible. I think there's this very deep spirit of Google about the belief in the power of access. And that carries to things like Google Search and Google Maps and Google Books, all the tools that we all, I'm sure in this room, use and love, hopefully love. But it also extends into the offline world. There's this spirit of the importance of access, the way access improves people's lives and does good in the world. And we look at systems like mass incarceration and how it marginalizes and disenfranchises millions of people. And we think there's a system that's denying millions of people access. And it gets Googlers pumped up and excited to disrupt that in the same way we disrupt other systems that prevent people from having access to information. The other piece of that mission statement that I think is really relevant for us is the actual word information. And I'll tell you a quick story about how that information piece of this mission really brought us into this work. The summer of 2016, after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were shot and killed, the Googlers, particularly the Black Googler network, came to Mab and I, and we had been working on this racial justice initiative, and they said, Justin, Mab, give us the data. Like, we're some of the best people in the world at doing analysis on data. Give us the data. We want to know how many Black people and people of color are being shot and killed by the police. We want to analyze it, and we want to put it up on search. We want people to be able to have access to this information. It's important information for the world to have. And we had to tell them that information doesn't exist. That data is not available. It's not accessible. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies, and that data is locked inside each one if it exists at all. And so they sort of pushed us and challenged us, well, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to go get that information? And so we reached out to partners like Measures for Justice and Amy Bach and Phil Goff and the Center for Policing Equity. And so our first step was to figure out how do we find community partners who are engaged in that data work. And we gave Phil and the Center for Policing Equity a $5 million grant, and we said, let's get out of your way, you go get that data. But we also always aspire to do more than just give money. And so what we did was our Black Googler network formed this group called Project Lifesaver, and they stepped up and said, we want to provide engineering resources to really get behind Center for Policing Equity. As they're collecting that data, how can we help build out the analysis? And so, long story short, we had an incredible team of 9 engineers, many of whom are with us today. Raise your hand if you're a Google engineer that worked on this project. So these are some of the heroes of our work. I know to you all they probably look like normal people, but inside Google, these are the kings and queens of Google. These are the people that make the magic happen. They create all the products that you all find incredibly useful and magical in your day-to-day lives. And they spent 6 weeks of their time and engineering talent to work with Center for Policing Equity and Dr. Goff on helping to build out what we call a CompStat for Justice. And I'll let Phil talk more about it, but we're incredibly proud of the work and going beyond the resources. Which I know nonprofits, we all need resources to be able to get the work done, but being able to go beyond the money, really roll our sleeves up in solidarity with our partners and do the work. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Goff and have him come up and tell you a little bit about the product.
Thank you very much, Justin. And I'm laved up because I can't stay
behind a microphone for too long. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't have much time, so I want to ask a very simple, straightforward question, one where there is an easy answer. How do you solve the problems of race in policing? Do you invest in anti-bias training? Do you campaign for your local DA to hold the bad cops accountable? Do you make officers live next to the people they are sworn to protect? Or do you just have to scrap the whole enterprise and start all over again? I've watched people wrestle with these questions for the majority of my professional and adult life. And over the past year, I've watched as the nation's attention has turned away from police reform. In part, this is a response to the political climate, but in part, this is in response to the despair that many feel when they realize there's literally no way to measure the scale of racial bias in policing. At least there hasn't been. But what if I told you there was a data tool that would allow us to hold law enforcement accountable to our shared values? The Center for Policing Equity, for the last decade plus, has been trying to build analytic systems that will allow that to happen. And today, briefly, I want to show you what can happen when nerds and geeks get together, when science and technology try and solve a problem collaboratively. Now, there are 4 things you need to be able to do if you want to create a police accountability tool, right? 1 and 2, you've got to collect the data in the first place. Right? Of the 18,000 police departments in the country, I would be surprised if 2/3 of them collected the kind of behavioral data that we would require for this. But after collecting the data, you have to standardize it, you have to clean it, you have to audit it, you have to know what's there. And the Center for Policing Equity began doing this before our collaboration with Google in 2012, literally just before Trayvon Martin was tragically shot and killed. Now, that National Justice Database, which is the data tool that we started with, covers about 1/3 of the United States by population. It is the first and largest standardized data set of police behavior in the history of the world. Please don't clap, okay? Because that is an embarrassment. We are happy at our humble brag, but it's a low bar, okay? But that National Justice Database, when we're doing it department by department, to collect the data, help them do that, to clean it and audit it, human beings, 3 of them with PhDs, usually takes them somewhere between 9 to 12 months to get that done. 9 to 12 months for humans to do it. That's because, and I'll give you just one example, in one of the data sets we received from a reputable police department, we looked at the address of a use of force incident. The address was cheese. The event happened at Cheese, apparently. I don't know if it was Chuck E. Cheese, if it was Brie Cheese, but it was Cheese. What I'm trying to tell you is the data are bad. But now, basically, with the press of a button, as a result of they call them engineers. I assume that they traffic with the Dark Lord and have magical powers. These folks at Google have been able to, see, they're laughing because they know it's true. These folks at Google have been able to provide us with a tool that will automatically audit, clean, and standardize the data set. So I'm going to show you a mocked up and what we call a masked data set. So these are not the raw data from Austin. They have been masked so that the data from Austin are not publicly available. But literally with the press of a button, this is what it would look like, what you're seeing on the screens here. You can see all of the missing data, right? All of the indecipherable, all of the impossible data, like cheese. A lot of cheese in this data set, right? All of those data are there. That's the step 1 and 2. Collect it, clean it. But once you've collected it and cleaned it, you got to map it. And the wonderful thing about Google Maps is that it's internal to Google. So what we're now looking at is all the use of forces of the last 5 years in the city of Austin, and each one of those is yoked to the census data of that geolocation. So now I know about the demographics. I know about the crime rate because they gave that to us as well. And in many of these departments, they will survey their officers, so I've got implicit and explicit bias in all of these regions. But mapping it is not enough. Step 3, you got to actually say, where are there disparities? And this is what this can look like, if I can get technology to work. There we go. This is a map. And you can see it's a heat map of where disparities between black and white are largest and smallest for use of force. Right? You can do this for black, Asian, American Indian, Latinx, non-white in general. You can do this for day, night, swing shift. For use of force, pedestrian stops, vehicle stops. You can see here in Division 6 what we're looking at. It highlights it, maps it, makes it easy. This is, by the way, what activists have been asking for quite some time, the ability to just do this in all the cities. This, by the end of the year, will be the touch of a button. I want to say this is not sufficient. This is disparities, and here's the key part of doing police reform. In cities, if I told you it was a 3-to-1, black folks more likely than white folks to have force used against them, you believe me. 4-to-1, 7-to-1. In some cities, it's literally 80 to 1. But if you're a good scientist or a skeptical police chief, what you'll say, and we have some of those in the room, how much of that is crime or poverty? And it feels almost like an insult, but it's also a reasonable question. It's what we were getting nationwide. How much of this is crime and poverty? How much of the disparity is inside the control of law enforcement, and how much is not? Well, as they say, we can build for that. These are now predictors. So I've got crime from the department, poverty from the census, racial bias from the survey that we do, and what we call residual, which is usually the policies of the police department. And what I'm showing you is a map of the most powerful predictor in each of the divisions of that police department, okay? And let's just go down here to racial bias. This is a heat map of the degree to which racial bias, actual bias, not ambiguous, saying I don't like black people, right? I can do this on implicit or explicit. By the way, because not all bias is implicit. This is a heat map, right, for where racial bias is the biggest predictor of actual behavior. You'll see it's a predictor, but across all of these, crime and poverty are larger predictors because the communities that are calling out for help in terms of their response to police, they're calling out for help for multiple things, not just police, not just a change in policing. And once you have this, at the click of a button, let me just say a couple things about what that makes possible. First, every police department in the country that collects these data, they soon will have no excuse for not knowing what they mean. And second, one of the things to know about police, as much as we're talking about the lack of data and data ignorance, police use data every single day to inform where they go. It's a system called CompStat. Now, if you haven't seen The Wire, briefly, here's what CompStat is. I'm going to see where my crimes are happening in my city. I'm going to deploy resources there. I'm going to deploy cops on dots on the map. And if they can't get it down just by showing up, they have to use creative problem solving. Well, what if we could create a tool that did the same thing, but for racial bias? That's what we're building here. Okay? That's what these amazing unicorns that traffic in the dark arts are able to do. And with this tool, police departments can treat racial bias like any other goal that matters. They can measure it, and they can improve it. Because it turns out human beings are pretty good at measuring things, and when they're prioritizing, improving it. We just haven't really tried that with racism before. So my hope is we'll decide to change that. This is the tool that I think can do that. Thank you guys very much.